So among the stem succulents, I'm going to cover two of these families. These are not the only stem succulents in the world, but as we go through this course, I'm going to try to cover the high points of the most memorable families. You can always build in your understanding as you go. So these are some families that are largely characterized by having stem succulent species. Cactaceae, the cactus family in particular, very full of stem succulents. And this other family, Euphorbiaceae, we'll see has a lot of diversity, not entirely stem succulents. So starting off with Cactaceae, this is the cactus family. When you write the word cactus, you're actually writing a genus name. So through a little bit of a quirk of the naming system, we don't actually use this genus name, but that's the genus name that the family Cactaceae was based on. So pretty memorable there. This is the literal cactus family. So as I have here, stem succulents. This is a family that is almost entirely species without leaves. So that makes them a little bit easier to recognize. If you've got a stem succulent and you don't have any leaves, you could be well on your way to identifying a plant in this family, Cactaceae. This family is also differentiated from the other big stem succulent family we'll talk about, in that this family is almost entirely in the Western Hemisphere. So North and South America, dry parts of those continents, of course. And so you can kind of take a global perspective on this and find out where your plants are. These both are also highly represented in cultivation. So if you get a cultivated plant, of course, you might not know which continent it came from, but hopefully we'll give you some tools to identify them. One of those in the vegetative structure are these clusters of spines. So kind of in place of leaves, in the locations where leaves would be, we often have these clusters of spines, sometimes long, sometimes shorter spines. These opuntia spines are kind of deceiving. They look fuzzy, but these will break off into your skin and be irritating. So this plant, I would say, is actually one I'd want to avoid more than one of these obviously spiky plants like the Echinocerius. On the flower level, very distinctive flowers for the cactus family. So we're now using this P abbreviation. So if you remember, P for perianth, and P is in use if we can't really distinguish between petals and sepals. So instead we have tepals, and a lot of them. So lots of use of the infinity sign here. Lots of tepals surrounding an andrecium with lots of stamens. And then gynoecium of sometimes a few, sometimes a whole bunch of carpels. But it's really that many tepals that also kind of gives this family away. And also, as we'll see, inferior ovary is useful for this family. So a little bit close up on some family flowers of Cactaceae. You can see those multiple perianth parts. This is almost reminiscent of something like the water lily we saw with this spiral phyllotaxis, and just tepal over tepal over tepal, and then finally giving way from what look a little bit more like sepals and gradually giving way to what are more like petals from the outside, from the inside. Again, ton of stamens here. And the inferior ovary, you can see it on here if you know what to look for. This portion is basically the ovary, and then there's a joined tube of tepals up for quite a long distance here. So this is associated with some of the animal pollinators that visit these. These are night blooming flowers, and this is a couple that might be visited by bats, for example. That inferior ovary develops into a fleshy fruit, and so the fruit type is a berry. And the inferior ovary, I like to point out here, is a nice strategy for protecting yourself. Again, we need to protect the juicy tissues in the desert. So if you've made a juicy berry, putting some spines on the outside of that becomes an option if you have an inferior ovary. So let me see if I can draw that for us here. So if you've got your ovary down here with your ovules on the inside, if that develops into a fruit, give us a little bit more parts here. So this is present in the flower. This being an inferior ovary, the ovary is here, but it's also kind of contained within some of the plant's standard skin. And so the skin, the epidermis of this part of the plant can be spiny. So this is extra protection against drying out, extra protection against animals chewing on your delicate ovary, also chewing on the developing and ripe fruit. At some point, of course, the fruit would be these ones that are colorful or dispersed by animals and attractive to animals, animals that can deal with the spikes and maybe figure out their way inside without getting hurt. But just kind of a nice adaptation. I think that's a neat way to remember these as flowers with inferior ovaries, is to think of them as having this extra layer of protection for their fruit. Locally to Wisconsin, we do have some native Cactaceae species, not many, but it is kind of worth noting. And if you ever stumble upon these, it's kind of a treat. One of those, as we talked with the geographic distribution of plants, this is one of those kind of Wisconsin plant groups that's more represented out in the western deserts. So they're in this genus called Opuntia, the prickly pear, and this is what they look like. Other ones, we've got a lot of diversity in the cactus family. This is a rather big family, rather charismatic family, and a lot of them sold just as houseplants. So houseplants you don't have to water a lot are pretty popular. That makes succulents a little more popular as houseplants. Some of these you might recognize, including the edible dragon fruit down here in the corner. I changed the name down here, Selenus but I didn't change it up here, Hylos. Both names have been used for those so-called dragon fruit, and you can see nicely the perianth parts surrounding that, kind of reminding you that we've got an inferior ovary for that. Not so spiny, but definitely inferior ovary. The saguaro cactus is noteworthy in this group, a very large cactus, very distinctive in the southwestern United States. This cholla cactus, as I'll mention, peyote is the plant that gives us one of these psychoactive drugs. Lophophora is the genus. This one, the so-called Christmas cactus, is in a fun genus called Schlumbergera. And let me go back to cholla for a second. This is a plant that's got spines with backwards pointing barbs, and they're really good at getting into skin, and they can actually transport bits of the stem and reproduce themselves vegetatively by attaching onto you. So if you ever do get one of these into your skin, this is the kind of extraction you have to do. If you pull them out with your hand is also fleshy, and you probably get them stuck in your hand. So I like this illustration of a person trying to help out the other person, in the process gets one on him. So the advantage for the plants is that these little units of stem that get stuck in the animal, in this case a human, those can root and start a new plant if they get dropped on the ground. So good way for them to get around, not by seeds, but actually just vegetatively bits of stem. All right, so the next stem succulent family, this is a family called Euphorbiaceae. And this one is a little more evenly distributed worldwide. It's got stem succulent plants in the Eastern Hemisphere, but it's also distributed fairly enough in the North and South America continents. So we'll say kind of on a general basis, if you find a stem succulent in Euphorbiaceae, you're more likely to be in the Eastern Hemisphere. So Africa, Eurasia, not so sure about Australia for this group, but definitely Africa, Eurasia. And as you might notice off the bat, this is a group that can produce leaves. So if you see a stem succulent that has leaves, that also can be a nice tag for you to recognize your family Euphorbiaceae. So stem succulents also quite prevalent, this abundance of milky sap or latex. And a lot of times this is toxic. So toxic to varying degrees, sometimes an irritant, sometimes a downright poison. And this is a good way to tell if you've got a succulent of one family versus another. Your Cactaceae succulents typically don't have, or I should say, don't have this milky latex, but plants in Euphorbiaceae do have the milky latex. That can help you to distinguish your succulent plants. Now they're not all succulent. They're not even all really what you would consider desert plants. We have some downright ordinary herbaceous plants in this group. This is one that you can find in Wisconsin, Acalifa. Looks pretty darn ordinary and doesn't look anything like a succulent plant, I would say. Looks a lot like other plants in other groups that are not succulent. Also some trees, as we will see. and lots of diversity in the floral structures. One thing you sometimes find in Euphorbiaceae is they kind of break what you would expect for putting the flowers together. So sometimes they have these so-called pseudo flowers. And one of these flowers, I'll point out this one on the right here. This is Euphorbia corollata, the flowering spurge. And it's got bits that look like female bits and bits that look like male bits. Turns out that this is actually a female flower and a male flower and a male flower. So it's what looks like a flower with parts in kind of the right places, but they're made up of individual flowers. Now, this is a developmental distinction. You wouldn't necessarily know it to look at these plants, but it looks a little off from what you'd expect for stamen, for example. So normally you get filament and then 2 parts to the anther. That's not too far off. This ovary up on a stalk, that's kind of unusual. Might tell you got something different. And then, I don't know, it's sort of off, I guess. So they're hard to zero in and see what else is going on with these flowers, the pseudo flowers, but they are different. All right, lots of economically important plants in this group. Some edibles, believe it or not. So this is still a very toxic group overall. And some of the plants that people eat are in this toxic category. So if you've ever had tapioca or manihot, cassava, a few different common names for that. Tapioca, these little tapioca pearls, they're starchy. They're actually made from these root tubers of this plant in the genus manihot. And people cultivate these, and you have to treat them to get rid of the toxins inside, but they are otherwise edible. Kind of a nice upshot, I guess, if you want to make sure that animals are not eating your food supply. Why not grow a toxic plant? Other ones, the source for rubber, still one of the main sources of rubber in the world, not much for a artificial synthetic supplement for good old-fashioned rubber. This is a South American native hevea. The rubber plant is basically this milky sap modified to become a squishy solid. And then one that you sometimes see planted, still very toxic, this plant called ricinus or castor bean, often planted as an ornamental and one of the most potent toxic seeds out there. So I think you can kind of see from these lots of diversity. I think for a lot of reasons, this is a hard family necessarily to just put some characteristics on identifying it. It's very diverse. And as you can see here, just even in the genus Euphorbia, about 2,000 species there. Lots to keep track of and hard to necessarily identify, but maybe one to, if you're kind of aware of the possibility of this plant group, you might be better able to identify it in the field. So locally, these are some we have native plants in Acalifa. As I mentioned, this has the common name of 3-seeded mercury. This is a little bit of unusual flower structure along the stem here. We do also have some members of the genus Euphorbia. Some of them used to be in other genera. Good example here, I showed you poinsettia earlier. This is another situation where the developing fruits are up here, and these colorful red bits are actually bracts associated with the fruits and not actually petals or anything like that.